Greetings, friends, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the University of Notre Dame. It means a great deal to us that you would gather with us. This is an important night for us. I'm Father Jim Leese. I am a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross, a Catholic religious community of priests and brothers. We were founded in France, and we thrive in all kinds of places throughout the world. The University of Notre Dame itself is rooted in a small city by London standards in northern Indiana called South Bend. And everything we do there, we hope to do everywhere. And so we create moments throughout the world where we will bring people together to talk about the things that matter. And I should say that we are a Catholic institution, and that means a great deal to us. And we welcome all, Catholic or not, to have a conversation with us about the things that matter most to us. And you will provide for us, as an attentive audience, to a matter that means a lot to us, business and human rights, an opportunity to think out loud as you engage Michael in the question and answers about what it is that we're about here in London, but throughout the world as an institution and as a church. We were founded, the institution itself, Notre Dame, by a French priest, Father Edward Sorin. The community itself was founded in 1837, and Notre Dame was founded in 1842, just 5 years later, and we have sort of taken off from there. And we are all over the world now, but we have 5 global gateways, one here in London, one in Rome, one in Beijing, a very Catholic country, I think you know, and one in, where am I now? We're in Dublin, yes, because that's, the Fighting Irish. And there's one more. Jerusalem. Oh my God, I'm embarrassed. Wouldn't we be where, Jesus hung out? Okay, but in any case, I am grateful that you are here. But I mention those things because it is important for you to know that Notre Dame hopes to engage a broader and deeper conversation about the things that matter to the church in the pursuit of truth in the ways that I think the world as best would understand. So I welcome you, and I am hopeful that you would pursue any opportunities that you might have to come to this little place. What I've learned since I've been here in the last less than a year that I've been here is that we're rather slightly known. And it's important for us that there be a wider understanding that this should be a place to convene many around conversations about faith. Not only the Catholic faith, but every faith and no faith. This is a place where we should be talking about the things that matter with regard to meaning and purpose. I'm going to begin with a prayer because that is what we Catholics do. But I want you to know that all who have any sense of appropriation for others would be welcome in this moment and know that we welcome you into this moment of prayer. I'll do it in the ways that we do it as Catholics, but I would hope that you would know that all are welcome into it. Heavenly God, we give you thanks and praise for the opportunities we have here to be in central London, to talk about the things that matter, to think about human rights and making the bond, as Michael will speak of. We ask you in this Holy Week, as we describe it, as we lead to celebrating the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, that we might know the resurrection in our own lives, and in this moment that it might be an opening for us and in our ways to understand and be enlightened in all the ways that you would have us be. We ask this in your holy name through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you. And I welcome Mr. Bloom.
Thank you very much. And my name is Phil Bloomer. I'm the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre and I'm here to play a role of chair. So please try and behave. I know you're all urging to misbehave tonight, but if you could try and constrain yourself, that would be great. And Michael Addo would be extremely grateful for that. I just wanted to say a few remarks before handing over to the lecture for Michael. I think the thing I wanted to say was really, the United Nations has played an absolutely fundamental role at the very centre of all the debates on business and human rights. It's been an extraordinarily turbulent time, really, for at least the last 40 years, and we've had many failed attempts at trying to build something like an international multilateral edifice around business and human rights. And many of us have probably got scars on our backs through those processes. But they were defeated by many different political battles, by gamesmanship, by political expediency, which inevitably affects multilateral organisations like the United Nations. But there was an attempt that actually was successful, which was in 2011 when, led by John Ruggie, but with the leadership of Kofi Annan, the UN guiding principles were approved. And at that point, there was also a UN working group approved. And at that point, they actually selected some members, including a man called Michael Addo, who came very shortly afterwards. And he's been on that working group for the last 6 years, at the same time as obviously just being a professor at Essex and then at Notre Dame. So I want to just emphasise the gift of time that Michael has given to that cause that we all believe in, that vision of human rights at the heart of business. Because it's not everyone, and it's not everybody's family either, that is prepared to put up with the scale of travel, the scale of investment of time, which is done alongside the actual job that Michael's had to do as a professor in business and human rights at the same time. And on top of that, of course, Michael's been the chair and the vice chair of the UN working group, but that involves yet more time, of course. And then I think the other thing I'd just say is, that last 6 years has not been plain sailing for Michael or for the rest of the members of the UN working group. It's been an extraordinarily turbulent time. Michael's had to put up with ranting, campaigning NGOs like myself and others, and we all obviously ask for your forgiveness. But I can't speak for everybody there, but just at least for me. He's also had to put up with very self-serving business interests and lobbyists. He's also had to put up with governments who are singularly uncompromising on some elements of business and human rights. And yet throughout that, Michael has kept a sense of proportion and a demeanour that has welcomed people into the debate on business and human rights, which is an extraordinary achievement. I know my patience would have been tested on many, many occasions when I've seen Michael remain extremely patient in those debates. So I think Michael's shown, that extraordinary resilience. He's shown extraordinary creativity in finding solutions. He's shown fortitude in the face of a lot of opposition to what the UN Working Group has been trying to do, a lot of criticism of the Working Group, because you can't please everybody in those circumstances. But I think he's also demonstrated a clarity of vision for the UN Working Group. And perhaps most of all, he's actually demonstrated the kind of people skills that are necessary for the UN Working Group to actually function as a working group itself and be able to project a new vision for what it would take to make human rights come to the heart of business. So I think we're very lucky to have Michael and to hear some of his very early reflections. Michael is leaving the UN Working Group in July. So this is by no means his remarks about his leaving, but I think we may be able to just listen in and hear some of those early reflections at least. So over to you, Michael, and then we're going to... Sorry. Michael will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go straight to questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Phil. I almost didn't recognize who you were introducing. That's very kind. I think the key in your introduction is the fact that I'm leaving the working group in July, and I'll be very happy demobbed, I tell you that. And while I still have 2 more months, I'm still bound by the rules and regulations of that wretched institution that I'm about to speak about, which means I still can't say too much, but I'll make one promise, which is that if you put a direct question to me, I will answer it. I wouldn't volunteer any information, but if you put a direct question, I will tell you what I know. Now, I want to join Phil and Father Jim in extending a warm welcome to one and all. I also want to thank you for joining us, because I think this is one of the key elements in celebrating 50 years of Notre Dame law in London. I think that's the whole point of the lecture. And this, of course, is the third in the series of monthly lectures that we're following. This will be followed by Mr. Justice O'Scanlan talking about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, next in April. So I think that will be a lot more exciting. I particularly want to welcome those of you who are discovering this place for the first time. And please, you're always welcome to return. So now back to the lecture. I've taken a very casual look at the attendance lists, and it seems to suggest a very diverse range of backgrounds and interests alongside a variety of levels of expertise and specialisms. So while I was composing the lecture, I thought, well, how do I pitch this? And I thought, it's just impossible in the 45 minutes that Phil is going to give me to try and pitch it to please everybody. And bearing in mind that what I really would like to say may offend some of the people that I work with, the best way out is to say nothing, or at least keep it very general. Keep it general so that those who have no experience of business and human rights will be perfectly happy, and those who are experts in human rights and business will say, we knew that anyway. And then we can follow that with question and answers where we can actually dig up some details. Now, I know one of the things I should do, and it seems a very good place to start, is to unpack the title. Because I know the phrase making the bond has exercised and stirred some curious minds, and people are asking, what exactly is the connection between business and human rights and making the bond? So I shall try and explain that to start with. And then I shall try also to sort of explore some assumptions that I have underlaid my presentation with. But then I'll take a much more critical look, and I call it critical, but not a critique, a critical look at the United Nations itself, primarily as an institution, whether it is as an institution is a suitable vehicle for making this bond, once we discover what the bond is. And then I will go ahead and look at some of the contributions that the United Nations has made. So here is where the secret lies in terms of making the bond. Now, I'm trying hard to go into okay, so it's now very clear that the phrase make the bond is taken from the dialogue of the movie Avatar. In that movie, for those of you who have seen it, the lead character, Jake Sully, travels to the mythical planet of Pandora via an avatar to help the local Navi people fight against destruction of their environment. Now, as part of that campaign, and as is the practice in Pandora, Jake is encouraged to get to know the local forms of transport, including having to fly a local bird known to be very feisty and untamed. They come in different shades. The worst of them all is called the Turuk, and I'll talk about that. He gets to fly the Turuk. To successfully employ the services of this generally unfriendly bird, he needs to subconsciously connect with this bird by planting the tail end of his very long hair into some part of the bird. Now, this act, often referred to making the bond, then aligns his consciousness with that of the bird. They develop a common understanding, and then they work together. Now, for those of you who have seen the movie but never understood this, or those of you who have never seen the movie and have no idea what this means, I thought I'll spend a few minutes just showing you a bit of the clip, because I couldn't resist.
Now you choose your Ikran. This you must feel inside. If he also chooses, you move quick like I showed. You will have one chance, Jake.
How will I know if he chooses me?
He will try to kill you.
Outstanding.
distanzi you! Zackenrazzi!
Let's dance. Det er pupskaven.
Depurati, Sanzio!
Met the bond! Sahelu, Jake! Sahelu!
That's right. You're mine.
But the gist of it will become a little bit clearer. Now, I draw great inspiration from this fictional scenario, not only because I like the phrase, make the bond, but because I think there are some very interesting lessons in the metaphor of making the bond for us in the field of business and human rights. Seeking a bond of common understanding across stakeholders and different cultures and different expectations in the field of business and human rights is a primary ambition. And wouldn't it be great if there were a way to metaphorically bond the consciousness and thus a common understanding amongst the different and diverse stakeholders in the field of business and human rights? Now, the idea that I want to canvass in this lecture is that the United Nations does facilitate opportunities for making this bond. And the question then is whether it is sufficiently effective in facilitating this. Continuing to unpack the title, it is useful to note that the United Nations is no more than a facilitator in this exercise, and that the real bonding will have to take place between the stakeholders themselves, whose understanding and of the place and the role of business in society is not currently aligned or remains unaligned. That stakeholders' perspectives are not aligned is one of the many assumptions that I make, alongside the assumption that the United Nations is an appropriate vehicle for facilitating bonding of consciousness. And these assumptions may require some kind of critical reflection, but it is fair to say that business and human rights is confronted with genuine tensions of competing values, the sort of tensions that are symptomatic of the different and often competing understandings of what is expected of the modern business enterprise. I think the business and human rights environment sort of sits with different sort of cultures. First of all, the liberal tradition of modern business environment, with this emphasis on freedom, in this case, freedom of the market, has an ironic twist in its representation of other freedoms, such as the human freedom, as an interference with the marketplace. It is an unfortunate loss of opportunity that those two concepts of freedom are not bonded. The separation of freedom, of the two freedom discourses, has influenced many generations of scholars and practitioners in the business and management fields, as reflected in the first quotation from Albert Carr in his article in the Harvard Business Review, that in the conduct of business, there's no obligation to stop and consider who is going to get hurt. If the law says a businessman can do it, that's all the justification he needs. And there's nothing unethical about that. It's just plain business sense. Fortunately, such extreme representation of business are rare, as management schools have adopted teaching to take account of moderation discourses, that's what I call them, such as business ethics and corporate social responsibility. Even on this same subject of the so-called adjustment discourse, there's no perfect consensus, as we have become used to critical comments concerning CSR, including the most iconic essays by Milton Friedman when he wrote or argued that CSR is pure, unadulterated socialism, and businessmen who talk this way are unwittingly puppets of intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of society. And as I understand it, in the United States context, there's no better insult than to call somebody a socialist. Now, later in the lecture, I propose to reflect a little bit more on the blending and bonding between CSR and human rights. But for the moment, I merely wish to point out the disparity of the starting positions of the different stakeholders. In contrast to the traditional starting position of the business and management discourse, the thoughts and activists of activists such as Phil Bloomer and other civil society advocates is premised on standards such as those set up in the Universal Declaration that all human beings are born free and equal with dignity and rights, and that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, whatever that means. You may want to ask Phil. Now, my point here is not necessarily to prefer or privilege a particular value discourse. It is rather in the nature of the liberal democratic tradition that we should hold and defend both concepts of freedom. As a consequence, different stakeholders in the business and human rights field have different perspectives of the language, and it is often as if they belong to different tribes inhabiting different and unconnected parts of the planet, maybe even a mythical planet like Pandora. But the reality that I wish to submit is, however, different, because there's a lot more in common between the stakeholders of business and human rights than divides them. Yet, ironically, there's not so much of a common understanding between the different actors, including governments, business enterprises, human rights, civil society activists, and independent scholars like myself. This is the task confronting the United Nations in seeking to harness the common elements of stakeholder values into a common understanding to which all can credibly subscribe. So now the question, of course, is whether the United Nations is a suitable vehicle for handling this facilitation. Now, I want us to turn our minds to this question of the suitability of the United Nations as an institution for facilitating the development of a common understanding between disparate stakeholders. This, after all, is an institution that suffers from an image cultivated over the years of a weak and politicized hired gun controlled by groups of countries, often undemocratic, or one that is structurally handicapped by factors like the veto on the Security Council. The criticism of the current and previous United States administration, and of course, if these two don't strike fear in you, I don't know who will strike fear in you, of the current administration is quite typical of how unfit the United Nations is for its purposes. Now, I submit that this image of the United Nations should be held in the context of general international organizations where most of their character and structure is anchored in what we call the Westphalian tradition, where international law actually relies on state mandates, and therefore certain handicaps are unavoidable. Our attention, in my opinion, should instead be focused on the progress and achievements that the institution achieves, nevertheless, regardless of these handicaps. In other words, I don't deny that the organization has some shortcomings. But to compound the problem facing the United Nations as a facilitator for the development of a common understanding between stakeholders, the organization has no express mandate in business and human rights, other than to craft in an imaginative way by interpreting its own objectives to secure some kind of understanding of its role. Within the broad and ambitious compass of securing peace and security, promoting respect for human rights, and ensuring development, every stakeholder expects the United Nations to represent them. And the efforts to reconcile these seemingly diverse interests and values is a challenge for the organization, and if successful, will be no less an achievement than Jake Sully succeeding in making the bond with Taruk. We think, for those of us who've seen the movie, quite some benefits follow being able to fly that bird. For what it is worth, some of the so-called handicaps may well be represented as opportunities for advancing business and human rights. This is an organization that has a strong convening power. It's a talking shop, but a talking shop is an excellent opportunity for dialogue. But it also has a very clear vision, and we recognize it as a repository of global values as set out in its charter. Furthermore, the United Nations has been successful in setting standards as a key necessity for business and human rights. It has provided a platform for the elaboration of these standards through bodies like the UN Working Group. In addition, has provided clear leadership in the terms of human rights, which is being emulated by other UN and non-UN agencies. Above all, and perhaps more important, is that the people in the different stakeholder groups look up to the United Nations to do something, whatever that something is, when crises arise. So how are these characteristics to be applied to the organization's role in facilitating the alignment of stakeholders' understanding of business and human rights? For this lecture, I propose to focus on 4 aspects of this contribution. First of all, in providing us with an identity of the subject of business and human rights. Secondly, then I shall look at the standard setting and the elaboration of these standards. Thirdly, I want to see the United Nations role as a leadership responsibility in steering coordination and cooperation in business and human rights. And finally, the worst of all, the talk shop as a facility for providing dialogue. So then I want to start with the identity of business and human rights. And I think Phil referred to some of this already. Now, first, and not so insignificant, is the label of business and human rights, which the organization, and I mean the United Nations, invented. As with most labels, the business and human rights label was not orchestrated in a very deliberate manner. Rather, it emerged out of a reaction to situations that was called to the attention of the United Nations. And looking back to calls such as those in the 1970s for a new international economic order, as part of which the regulation of the activities of transnational corporations was central, we get to understand a little bit more how this came about. The differences, for example, between the government of Chile in the 1970s and an American corporation, International Telephone and Telegraph Company, the ITT, was fairly typical of this, because as part of that disagreement, the then president of Chile, Salvador Allende, decided to spend all his address time of the General Assembly to this issue in 1972. Well, he succeeded in pushing the United Nations to do other things, amongst other things, the establishment of a commission for transnational corporations with a mandate to draft a code of conduct. The reason I mention all of this, particularly for identity purposes, is to suggest that this was one of the very first times when human rights and business were mentioned in a single document. In other words, human rights became part of the code of conduct. We know the code of conduct failed because it was never adopted, but other institutions, either in protest to the code of conduct, the OECD being an example, also adopted its alternative documents like the OECD Declaration and Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises, which incidentally also referred to human rights. Around the same time, the ILO also developed its Tripartite Declaration on Multinational Enterprises with the human rights content. However, the business and human rights label did not crystallize until, as Phil quite rightly pointed out, in the 1990s and early 2000s with the advent of 3 turning points. First, the United Nations Global Compact, followed by the failed, and I'll refer to this in a moment, draft norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises with regard to human rights in 2003, and then finally the endorsement by the United Nations Human Rights Council of the guiding principles on business and human rights. Surprisingly, by this time we take for granted the label of business and human rights, and yet we never quite understood what it meant. So even with a clear and very specific label, the duality of its identity was recognized in the manner in which this was represented. Business and human rights, with an emphasis on the conjunction and, some have suggested that this form of representation with a conjunction and should be distinguished from the second form with the ampersand, business and human right, which they prefer because it's much more of an indication of a blended identity. Even the way you write it can make a lot of difference. And there are others for whom neither of these is good enough. It's totally unsatisfactory because they believe if you start the label with business, it means you prefer and you prioritize the business values over the human rights values, and so they would prefer to reverse it and have human rights and business. And again, let's not get into that. The idea being we have the label, but we have no idea where we're going. So moving on and cutting to the chase, for whatever it is, the modern business and human rights framework that the United Nations has helped to craft, no matter which version we have of it, is founded on some very core and critical principles. In other words, we understand, whichever way you represent it, that it has come about with a clear understanding of some key principles. Number one, that we should challenge some clear orthodoxies. The orthodoxy that the multinational corporation is a demon of some sort. We need to be able to challenge that. It also comes with the understanding after years and years of practice that we must challenge the idea that the state is the center of the universe and that the state is able to solve all problems. Rather, business and human rights emphasizes a sense of shared responsibility between stakeholders. So the UN Guiding Principles, for example, is based on a combination of the state duty to protect against human rights violations and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Yes, it is fairly understandable that these are not equal burden sharing because the primary responsibility will rest on the state to show some leadership. Similarly, different stakeholders have different but complementary roles concerning the provision of remedies in the event of violation, which is quite critical, that we should get away from the idea that the companies are awful and that only the state will solve them. Otherwise, we'll never solve this problem. The other point that comes out very clearly out of the human rights and business lesson is the idea that we tend to privilege outcomes without thinking of processes. And that for us, if we really want to make an effective bonding of our consciousness, then we must give some attention to the process. And just to give you a very interesting example, the question of why the UN norms failed was simply not because the content was wrong. In fact, the content was very robust. The process was different. It had very little consultation, it had a top-down structure, and it failed simply for that purpose. The UN Guiding Principles, on the other hand, that focus largely on multi-stakeholder consultation, making sure the businesses have a hand, something to say, and the government has something to say, and the civil society groups had enough to say, really came out with pretty much the same as the norms, but was accepted because he followed the right process. The next thing that I think the principles of business and human rights tell us is that we must affirm certain values are common to all of us. Number one is freedom, and freedom in all its forms should be central to what we say. Rule of law is critical, that we must be based on we must be driven by a rule-based society. Human dignity in all its forms is critical. Democracy is fairly critical to business and human rights. And this is the basis upon which Kofi Annan addressed the business community in Davos in 1999 and invited them to join the United Nations in the Compact for Good. This is what we now know as the Global Compact because he preached the importance of these shared values. Next, I want to talk about the importance of chinwag or dialogue, also very critical in terms of having constant cooperation, consultation across stakeholder communities. We must, as much as possible, involve all stakeholders if we think we're ever going to bond our consciousness with each other. We must also begin to privilege everything that we already know. We must have a sense of a smart mix. So there's a sense in which we don't quite ignore or throw away CSR, for example. It has a place to play. We must not throw away corporate codes of conduct because they too have a place. And we must think of preventive measures as much as we think about curative measures when it's unavoidable. And state-based mechanisms must live side by side with non-state-based mechanisms or initiatives. Again, if we want to bond consciousness, these are some of the principles. The importance of blended language, and this is quite critical in our understanding. We need to be able to pool terms that mean a lot and mean significantly to different communities. And I mean terms like due diligence, which for the corporate community means something quite smart. But we can reinterpret due diligence in a way that we could all have a common understanding of what due diligence means. The same way we could use phrases like risk management, social responsibility in a manner wide enough to take account of the business opportunities or business understanding and the stakeholder understanding. Also, I want to emphasize the importance of evolution because business and human rights is not a revolution. We are constantly making mistakes, and with this mistake, we need to learn. And learning from our past mistakes is the best way going forward. And then the business case. And most scholars will tell you, or most activists will tell you, this is probably the thorniest of the bonding principles, because it suggests that there is a way in which we can make business pay, make human rights pay, making it worthwhile financially to respect human rights. Over the years, I have tried to look for the evidence of how business or how human rights increases the bottom line. And what I've tended to find is the corollary, which is that human rights can cost your bottom line. And these are two different things. And we must not confuse them. So there may not be a business case that suggests that respecting human rights will increase your profit, although sometimes the body shop thinks it does. But I think what is more evident is the fact that if you don't respect business, you don't respect human rights, it can cost you your reputation, it can cost you financially, it can cost you legally. And then finally, we ought to be flexible and adaptable. The business landscape is very diverse. The difference between the General Motors and the small, medium-sized enterprise in Middlesbrough, very different. But we need to apply human rights in completely different ways and being faithful to the principle, but being pragmatic in how this works. So the character and identity of business and human rights is a product that only an institution like the United Nations can construct. Only the United Nations has the level of convening power, the credibility, and leadership to command the attention of all key stakeholders. In addition, some aspects of the organization's own character, including the so-called handicaps, have proved to be very useful in the process. The organization's idealism, its persistence, and its talking shop, which instead of condemning, we can find as important ingredients for getting us to talk together. The identification of the parameters of business and human rights, which continues to evolve, cannot be oblivious to the long-established discourse on corporate social responsibility. I did promise to come back to this. Now, while CSR is traditionally grounded in corporate philanthropy and the importance of giving back to society, and therefore at the discretion of managers, it is not difficult to appreciate the practical, if not necessarily the conceptual overlaps and interfaces between CSR and human rights. A Swiss professor, Florian Westin from the University of St. Gallen, has written quite extensively about what he calls 3 waves of interface between CSR and human rights. The first wave he identifies as very sporadic activities exemplified by the positions taken by companies in the apartheid regime in South Africa, where CSR pretty represented objecting to apartheid. Then he identified a second wave in the 1990s, where the focus was fixed on adverse impacts of corporate supply chains and sweatshops, with the migration of labor or production to the Far East. Then the final wave of the interface is the recent coming together of CSR and human rights under the Global Compact and the UN Guiding Principles, where there is no sense of shyness about the relationship between the two identities. So the discourses are by no means completely aligned, i.e. between CSR and human rights, because CSR continues to have that managerial discretion and the strategic value of the enterprise at the heart of it, whilst human rights talks about corporate responsibilities and talks about stakeholder entitlement. So the two conceptual foundations are not mutually exclusive or incompatible, because we can recognize the common objective of both the moral and the legal imperatives in seeking to humanize business. And that's the primary objectives of both. The two discourses are not too far apart in their ambitions, and it won't be too long before they are bonded to the common understanding. This is especially true of the international standards of business and human rights as they take root at the national level through legislation, by which point CSR becomes part of national legislation. And the best example I can draw at the moment is the Modern Slavery Act of this country, and to some extent the French vigilance law, which requires companies to begin to undertake due diligence. And at this point, it ceases to become discretionary and could become compelling. Now, so next I want to move on to the second contribution of the United Nations in setting standards. And this is one of its greatest achievements, of the organization across many fields, including standards in areas like sustainable development, disarmament, arms control, environmental sustainability, human rights, anti-corruption, organized crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, maritime regulation, money laundering, medicines regulation, international trade, intellectual property, dispute settlement, and the use of force. I've run out of breath. There's still a little bit more. Now, this is the pedigree from which the United Nations turned its attention to developing standards for business and human rights. And yes, after the initial flops with the Code of Conduct and the UN norms, today the Global Compact and the UN Guiding Principles represent the most authoritative set of international standards to guide stakeholders. In addition to the standards set out in the Global Compact and the UN Guiding Principles, the United Nations set up the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, collection of so-called experts, I'm not quite sure how true that is, to help disseminate the guiding principles and promote its implementation. As part of that mandate, the working group took up the mantle in a strategy to seek out, to reach out to new audiences. Also, and I can explain why this all happened the way it did, to strike partnership arrangements with agencies, funds, and programs, as well as with other international organizations such as the European Union, the OECD, the African Union, the Organization of American States. Similar partnerships have been struck with business associations and individual businesses that have sought to engage directly with the work of the working group. In addition, the working group has recommended the development of national action plans for the implementation of the guidelines, again, the effect of which I can discuss in Q&A. And more importantly, the working group has tried to elaborate on the meaning of some of those principles in the preparation of its thematic reports. Now, the provenance and the character of the guiding principles reflects some of the very important key principles that I have previously mentioned. The majority of stakeholders, including governments and business enterprises and even civil society and advocacy groups, have responded fairly positively to the guiding principles. The partnership with the OECD to enhance the practical significance of the guiding principles has been one of the success stories of interinstitutional collaboration, because starting with the 2001 update of their 1970 guidelines on multinational enterprises, the OECD incorporated the guiding principles directly, and the OECD has followed that up by reaching directly to stakeholders with specific sector-specific guidances on matters such as supply chains in the garment industry, in the footwear industry, and with minerals from conflict-affected areas. Now, these forms of collaboration are especially important because the different institutions reach different constituencies, and the OECD in particular reaches out to the businesses that are based in the home state countries, particularly the transnational corporations. And to be able to therefore sell the guiding principles to these entities is particularly the success that maybe the UN itself could never have done. So it's quite useful to have that partnership. In addition, they have a dispute settlement system called the National Contact Points, which is now completely, fully referencing the UN guiding principle. So those standards that the UN has set have become particularly pervasive. Now, speaking further about standard setting, other United Nations agencies have similarly adopted the guiding principles in their work. So the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, whose mandate includes providing advice and assistance in the negotiation of bilateral investment treaties, have adopted the guiding principles as one of those recommended terms to put into investment treaties. In the same vein, the United Nations human rights treaty bodies have begun to elaborate on the implications for member states of the UN guiding principles. So in addition to their concluding observations and their recommendations to states in this field, some treaty bodies, such as the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, have adopted fairly lengthy general comments elaborating on these implications. Other United Nations human rights bodies, including the Special Procedures and the Universal Periodic Review, have also applied the same standards on business and human rights. Now, here is the problem. The increasing activity by the different policymakers and international mechanisms is exciting and progressive, but it creates the risk of the kind of policy incoherence that stakeholders detest. Most companies will tell you they're rather fed up with the idea of different and many sort of standards. And the UN Working Group has been acutely aware of this risk, and continues to strive towards policy alignment and coherence. And this is evidenced in the efforts to clarify confusion whenever it arises or when it's generated by sector-specific interpretation. And the example that I have in mind is the banking sector tried to interpret some aspects of the guiding principles, which the working group came out very heavily and said they'd got it wrong and tried to persuade them to revisit it. We fought it in the end, but it came out fairly well. That's all I can say. Moving on, I want to talk very quickly about the leadership role of the United Nations. And I think the starting point is fairly simple. There's only one United Nations and only one global institution. Consequently, it provides the opportunities for global vision, strategy, and plans that no other institution can countenance. This defines the sort of leadership role vis-a-vis other regional entities, as well as national authorities. The leadership role of the United Nations is especially important for the subject like business and human rights, for which the impact of globalization compels us to take a no less than global view of the policies that we come up with. So unless we can have the kind of leadership that brings together everybody, it's impossible to be able to make the bond. And it is arguable that the organization has not been particularly successful as a leader in the field of business and human rights because of the well-known blunders and mistakes it committed in the very early years. However, once it developed sufficient strong credentials and credibility in its narrative, the management of its activities, it gained the respect of most stakeholders. And this is true because of the uptake of the UN Guiding Principles by organizations such as the OECD, the EU, the Council of Europe, UNCTAD, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and many more. Similarly, national authorities have responded positively to the calls by the United Nations to develop national action plans, of which there are currently about 17 and another 30 in production. And it is important that individual stakeholders recognize this leadership role in crafting a common understanding in the field of business and human rights. Business associations, and I know some of them are here, so I'd like to mention those who have quite expressly acknowledged the leadership of the UN, including the Global Business Initiative, the International Organization of Employers, and ICMM and IPICA, amongst those who have come out fairly openly supporting the United Nations. And so this raises the interesting question, why does anybody bother listening to the United Nations? And to this question, I'll come up in a moment. I'll come up once I've had a chance to talk about the talking shop. So this brings us to the final ways in which the United Nations has facilitated blending and bonding of stakeholders' consciousness towards a common understanding of business and human rights. The organization has been accused fairly often of being no more than a talking shop. This is meant in the very critical context to be an insult and a handicap. And this does ring true in many United Nations contexts. But this same insult, the same institutional shortcoming, can be a virtue in other contexts. Providing an environment for dialogue has proved to be an invaluable opportunity for business and human rights. Firstly, the building of trust between untrusting actors. Dialogue is the only way to make progress. The United Nations commands sufficient respect of all stakeholders to back up its convening power at meetings to discuss unsettled issues. Kofi Annan's dialogue in Davos was a key precursor to the Global Compact, as was John Ragg's practice of multi-stakeholder consultation as an essential element of crafting the UN Guiding Principles. Today, the legacy of dialogue continues in the regular UN consultations to seek clarification and better understanding of different aspects of business and human rights. Such consultations are standard practice of most UN agencies, including the Working Group on Business and Human Rights and other special procedure mandate holders who have been involved with business and human rights. Of all the opportunities that the United Nations provides for dialogue, the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, where all stakeholders are brought together to discuss issues and share their experiences as well as their challenges, is a unique one and perhaps the most successful. Now, I want to now talk about why anybody pays attention to the United Nations. Now, one may say that the United Nations has been fairly successful so far and in the current circumstances in facilitating the blending of cultures and the development of a common understanding in business and in human rights. It is worth spending some time reflecting on the reasons behind this level of support. The compliance or non-compliance with international norms is often attributed to a variety of factors, including, on the one hand, factors such as persuasion, incentive, coercion, discourse, and acculturation. Didn't put it on the list because I couldn't quite pronounce it and wondered whether I should be acculturation. And on the other hand, the lack of material incentives, counter-normative standards, and weak and effective processes of dissemination and implementation alongside local constraint. Now, for business and human rights, the subject requires further and detailed study. But in the short term, we see some evidence of the whys and the hows concerning compliance by stakeholders. There's a very clear evidence of discourse and persuasion in the changing of the manner in which business is conducted. Here we know that enterprises are very concerned about their reputation and they're concerned about financial damage, and so any form of persuasion is very likely to be taken into account. And the United Nations, in bringing this form of conversation together, is extremely helpful. There's also evidence of incentives in the form of seeking to level the playing field. For businesses, it is quite useful that they all contribute to leveling the playing field. I'm not quite sure some of the Chinese companies have heard about leveling of the playing field, but at least the effort is being made by businesses that it is in their interest to level the playing field to respect human rights. But more importantly, the incentive lies in the fact of the so-called business case, which sadly continues to be represented in the form of human rights increases your profit, which I dare say is not the case. It's much more the case that if you ignore human rights, you can be adversely affected. So far, there is not much evidence of coercion in play as a basis of compliance, but as the field evolves into national legislation, such as the Modern Slavery Act, we can see the place of coercion as a reason why we will ever pay attention. As a counter-explanation, the uptake may be slow, because some, or in certain cases, many stakeholders have not been part of this conversation at all concerning business and human rights. In that sense, they cannot be persuaded and they don't see the value of the incentives. Most of them are still committed to the normative standards of laissez-faire market rules and standards. And these stakeholders do not appreciate the articulation of incentive arguments either. When the state of affairs is coupled with poor communication of the changing standards, and then progress becomes very slow. In some countries, especially in the developing world, policymakers are genuinely conflicted and confused as to the best way forward. One such example is when developing countries are very keen on open investment strategies, and as part of it are not so sure where human rights should sit. In reality, of course, this tension is more of a phantom rather than a reality, because human rights and investment should not be incompatible. Now that the process of evolving business and human rights has gained traction, I think the United Nations should now focus its attention on the implementation of standards. And this will require, as usual, the cooperation and support of all stakeholders. The next question, of course, is, has it been very plain sailing all the way? Well, if so far this lecture seems to suggest that there has been plain sailing in the evolution of business and human rights, perhaps I should remedy that miscommunication before I sit down. You will not be surprised to hear that it has not been plain sailing, and there has been challenges for the United Nations in seeking to deliver this common understanding. I have already alluded to the structural handicaps of the institution, like the United Nations, having to work within the constraints of its mandate, which at the best of times is unclear, and at the worst of times is very clearly limited. In addition, it's a multi-agency institution with different levels of autonomy across the institutions. The consequence of this is that there is not a smooth flow of information or a common agenda between the different parts. So whilst the Human Rights Council, and to some extent the Third Committee of the General Assembly, alongside agencies such as the ILO, UNICEF, and UNCTAD, are busy doing business and human rights, other institutions such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, have no idea what business and human rights means, and they're all part of the United Nations. It's rather sad and rather ironic that these are the institutions with a much closer affinity with the business community. Some stakeholders remain unsatisfied with the robustness of the current standards and continue to clamor for stronger standards. The governments of Ecuador and South Africa have been pushing for binding instruments on business and human rights, arguing that the current standards in terms of the Global Compact and the UN guiding principles are not strong enough. This matter currently rests before an intergovernmental working group on business and human rights, and so the impact of this parallel process has not yet been explored. Finally, the UN draws on world experts, so it says, and this is a common and very good thing for it to do too, because these experts can bring their years of knowledge to the United Nations. Unfortunately, they are not embedded in the organization, and they are mostly part-timers. Being part-timers means they don't get to follow through with some of the suggestions and recommendations they make, and therefore some of the suggestions, often very good, never get implemented. So where do we go from here? Well, it seems to me the business and human rights genie is out of the bottle. It's the bottle or the pot. And the question now is how best to take advantage of its potential. Well, there are a number of things we could do. First of all, we have to try and build on the current gains. We know that the subjects and the standards have now been accepted. We have clear standards. We have clear appreciation of these standards. We now need to implement them. And I've heard the phrase implementation, implementation, implementation. We also have to develop a slightly more imaginative way of following on some of our recommendations. So the idea of asking countries to develop national action plans was launched about 4 years ago, and until now, there are only 17. There's got to be a better way to achieve more national action plans, or there are better ways of communicating business and human rights to the business community. We have to ensure internal coherence and possibly external coherence as well. That within the United Nations itself, the agencies are not talking to each other and they're not talking human rights. It's a problem of credibility, because you very easily get pointed to say, well, look, clean up the United Nations and then we will pay attention to you. There have been instances where the United Nations itself has used security personnel who have not complied with human rights conditions. So again, these are the things that you need internal coherence. And we also need coherence between the organizations like the OECD and the EU and the United Nations. We also have to be very faithful to the principles that we thought drive business and human rights. Dialogue, for example. Flexibility, for example. The business case when we come around to make it. The smart mix. And being attentive to the process. I think that's quite critical. Now, with this in mind, if we can ever achieve this kind of progress, then we can make the bond. And if we're lucky, we can then begin to fly with the Turuk. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was an extraordinary lecture and an extraordinary exposition, I think, of both your experience but also the extraordinary challenges which the whole business and human rights movement in all its diversity faces. So it's now open for questions, so anybody who'd like to get on the Turuk is welcome to join the conversation now. We've heard, I think, some extraordinary things from Michael. I think just, if I could just summarise a few things, I think, first of all, that fundamental issue about the moral case for business and human rights, the normative case for human rights, and also the business case, whether it's a positive or a negative business case for human rights. We heard about the identity issues in business and human rights, but also the issue of standards and the development of those standards, which has been extraordinary, I think, over particularly the last 6 years. And then also that leadership role that the UN has played, which has made such a difference, as well as then that dialogue that's been so key and the process issues that you highlighted again, I think. I think the other thing is then the structural challenges, which I assume would be very good to be questioning. I want to just reaffirm what Michael's promised, that he will answer questions that he is asked. So on those challenges, we had structural handicaps, we had intra and inter-institutional coherence, including the other UN bodies. And then, of course, the issue of the binding instrument and the treaty which is on the table, as well as the other aspects of more mandatory approaches, as you mentioned, the French law, for instance. And then this whole issue about the way the UN functions in terms of part-timers. So that's given you enough time now to think about all your impertinent questions. So who'd like to go first? Please, sir, over there. Just introduce yourselves, if you would, to the floor, just so everybody knows who's speaking. But Michael knows you, I know.
Robert McCorkadale. I guess I have two questions. The first one is, In your remarkable leadership of the working group, one of your initiatives was, of course, about the national action plans. And you say there's only 17 of them. Is that a wasted effort? I mean, how much of the legislation that has actually come out by states have been based on the National Action Plan? You mentioned the Modern Slavery Act. That had nothing to do with the National Action Plan. The French legislation on due vigilance hasn't really come out of that. So there's a lot of effort going into it, but is it actually any point at all? Mm-hmm. And the second one is, I guess, to what extent do you find the UN institutionally of any assistance to the working group? Because you're working all the time with UN people, I don't mean the states, but the actual UN people. How much are they open to the idea of this tremendous challenge of a law which isn't just about states, but is actually about those who are non-state actors? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take groups of 2 or 3. We have 2 questions, so I'd like another one if we could. Who else would like to ask a question? Please.
O'Rourke, Mendoza College of Business. Michael, I'm wondering, in view of the criticism of the UN as a talking shop, what levers are left if we think of the UN as really just having moral suasion, just having the ability to call out bad actors? If that's discredited from the beginning, what other levers are left to assure compliance?
Great, thank you. So we had 2 questions there from Robert and 1 here from James. Thank you very much. Do you want to just come back on those and then we'll go out to another round of questions?
Okay. Right. First of all, I am very glad, Robert, that you asked this question about national action plans. But more importantly, I think your second question is one of those very direct ones that I promised to answer. And yes, I will try and answer. No, I don't think the 17 national action plans are a waste of effort. Because the guidance that the UN prepared for national action plans also suggests that countries can take what we call the step-down entry points. And in fact, one very specific recommendation to the UK, not that they ever listened, was that the Modern Slavery Act was a better entry point than the National Action Plan they had written. But most countries are thinking of big things all the time. In fact, legislation on health and safety, for example, is a good entry point. Legislation on child labor and forced labor, which all of them have. So the idea is to get them to recognize what they do well and then make an undertaking to improve it, rather than thinking of creating something. I don't think that message did transfer well enough. Almost everybody that tried to write a national action plan created this super version. So that, I think, was a poor communication on the part of the working group. But for the 17 that we had, I think that's great that we have that. And I think the working group continues to push for the entry point. And if they did that, I think we'll have over 150. So that, I think, is a good starting point. There's also some sides to it, that the moment Colombia, for example, had one, certainly Chile wants one, Brazil wants one. So that one can trigger a little bit more. And I think once the UK had its one, imperfect as it was, suddenly the Danish one came, the Dutch one came, and so on, and everybody turned. So it does have quite some value. How open is the institution to well, I wouldn't say radical change. Well, to put it very bluntly, very little. It is an institution that's stuck in its old ways, and they have some very strange sensitivities, particularly the fear of being seen to be critical of states, which is very odd, because that's exactly what they ought to be doing. But everybody's very concerned about one country being criticized and therefore the whole institution falling apart. So if you're an outsider and you're suddenly coming, you do have to struggle through this trickle of UN practice and having to do things differently. Just to give you a very simple example. If you did any work for the UN and you wanted to have a researcher, not just you, but a researcher had to be approved. And the process of having one of your PhD students doing research for you very quickly doesn't work. So of course, the only way to do that is to ignore all of that. Go behind the UN and then produce a document, but you can't acknowledge the PhD student because they hadn't been approved. So these are very awkward things that it stops you from doing. It does feel frustrating, but once you understand the way they work, you then find counter ways of dealing with it. So the answer to your question is, I wish they were a little bit more open, a little bit more radical in the way they receive new ideas. But that's just the way I see it. And, back to James's point about if we discredit some of the moral aspects of what the UN does, what is left? Well, I was actually hoping in the lecture to try and talk up some of these so-called discredited moral positions of the UN. So I want to see talking shop not as a weakness, but talking shop as more as a strength and a virtue. And I think there's a lot more about some of the aspects of the UN that we condemn that really should not be. And in the context of business and human rights, that was a perfect example. Without this talking shop, we would never have achieved anything. So yes, there is room to use those counter-arguments to develop strength in the organization rather than to fall down all the time. I don't know if that answers your question. So there is still hope.
Great. We'll go to one more round of questions and then we'll perhaps finish. I see 1, 2. Any others? Another one, thank you.
Hi, my name's Ben Rutledge. If I could ask, if you could highlight, name a high and a low, one of your greatest achievements or your proudest moments and one of your greatest frustrations during your time on the working group, what would they be? And you referenced the...
Okay, turn off the mics now, thank you.
Just wondered, you mentioned the Tun Banking Group and the challenge there. Are there other business groups that have tried to undermine the standing of the UNGPs or the working group during your tenure?
I'm Tim Cook. I'm a barrister practicing in this area of law. My question was, what excites you most about in the area of remedy? It strikes me that forums to take complaints are extremely rare, and when you look at the examples such as the NCP process under the guideline for multinational enterprises, you find there's a very weak application of the existing standards and an entirely unrobust forum. And then when you look at litigation in the home country against multinational companies, of course that's not the actual application of the UN GPs per se, instead it's conventional old-fashioned tort law or the application of statutory law. You benefit, certainly in this jurisdiction, from robust rule of law and so on. But those cases are again vanishingly rare. So those examples are rare. Most impacts, adverse impacts in my analysis do remain unremedied. Are the things in the remedy sphere that excite you, or put more directly, what are the major obstacles to the implementation of an effective remedy regime within the United Nations or elsewhere?
Thank you. Just wait for the mic and then.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks. I'm John Nagel. I am a professor here with the Law School at Notre Dame. And my question is this. My expertise is in environmental law. And for about 25 years, the UN sought to address the problem of climate change by trying to come up with some, widely shared agreement that could then be, enforced against the world at large. Failed miserably. Paris Agreement comes along, flips the tables, bottom up from each country to try to achieve it. Has that model kind of led into this kind of context as well, or are there any kind of lessons of that approach for what you've been doing, with the human rights and business context?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, and then we'll just take one more, please.
I'm Susan Hawker. I'm an adjunct professor here at the London programme. I'm in shipping. My question was to follow on from what this gentleman, who's a human rights lawyer, asked. He asked about remedies. What would be your hope? My question would be, do you find yourself ever hoping for a disaster? And I know this is a very sort of contentious and unsavoury question to ask, but in shipping, we have two United Nations family. We have the IMO, to which Michael referred, and we have the ILO. And some of the excellent, very regulatory work that has created standards to which everyone is committed because of market reputation. And committing to these standards doesn't increase your profits, but it certainly stops you becoming unprofitable by losing market reputation. The efforts in shipping have all all been driven by some disaster. And it strikes me, you have a disaster that the world focuses on. It's something that propels you along very quickly and enables you to have something that's accepted on the international market that is more than your complaint of just national tort or statutory law. So do you pray for a disaster? A public, focused disaster.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Yeah,
and
well,
and a challenging one, but certainly something that the Rana Plaza disaster, for instance, would be a highlight for us. Over to you, Michael.
A few years ago, I wrote an article on the value of dictators to the development of human rights, and actually tried to argue, and I've never lived it down, but I thought I'll sort of talk through it, that not that we ought to be grateful, but it's because Hitler went so mad that we paid attention. But it wasn't just him. If you look back in history, we always react to desperate situations. I'm not so sure that I will pray for one, because I know how difficult circumstances can be. But I welcome one as a way of waking us up. I don't know where I draw the line, but yes, if you look back at business and human rights and the relationship in Nigeria between Shell and the Ogoni people, once it became a disaster, Shell paid attention, and so on and so forth. So disasters have their very constructive interpretation. So I don't know what to say, but I'll pray for one, but I will welcome one. I think, was it Ben? Somebody asked a question about high and lows of my time on the working group. I think I set myself up for this. I think my favorite time on the working group is country visits, where you get to meet the people you imagine, the people that you talk about in your papers, and you see the real life of what the victim goes through. It changes your perception completely on what you think you should do. Because at that time it empowers you very much to be able to bulldoze your way with seeking a remedy. And you can only see that when you go there. And so country visits. And I have got some very interesting examples, one or two. On a visit recently to one particular country, we knew there was an issue with an extractive company that was struggling with its license. The chief executive of that company, based in the United States, called us and gave us where he thought the situation was, and argued that they had reached a sensitive point with a particular group, a particular community, about negotiating land rights. And that could we at least stay away from getting involved with that particular instance while we're visiting the country, just to give these people the chance to reflect on some of the negotiations. We thought it was a fair way. So we went and did this on this 10-day country visit. Into day 8, when we met the civil society group, a very unassuming gang, very, very simple gang, turned up, not speaking English, and had an interpreter who spoke English very badly. But it took less than a minute for us to recognize who she was or who that group was. And the story they told us was so different. The story included having bulldozers at the front of their house. They planted their maize and they let cattle loose on the farm, literally drumming them out, as in beating drums so they can get out. This is not what the chief executive told us, but on their website, they're committed to human rights and all that. So we suddenly woke up. Now, had we not been there, none of this would have made sense. So that's just, for me, that's a highlight. The low side of this is preparing to communicate what we have seen to the United Nations, where you have to use a particular kind of language and you have to moderate your communication so that nobody gets offended. Now, for me, I find that incredibly frustrating. Even more frustrating is that I cannot use any of that material while I still, as an academic or as a scholar, while I still work on the working group. Now, that I find incredibly frustrating. But that's the high and the low. Have there been other groups who have tried to interpret the guiding principles? Yes. And they're not groups, governments. The Norwegian pension fund. And when we think about Norway, we think all. And they started having trouble with their national contact point about the interpretation of their responsibilities. And the national contact point had the presence of mind to draw the working group into it. It was just so wrong. It was just misunderstanding, or maybe, I don't know whether it was deliberate. But at least when we got involved and backed the national contact point up, somehow the government intervened. So we do have pockets of those happening here and there. So it does, and the Toon Group is not the only one, even though theirs went quite public about it. Remedy. What excites me about Remedy? Do you know? Simplicity. Simplicity. That what makes the victim satisfied. If only we will stand aside and figure out exactly what it is the victim is looking for, or what is it that will put the victim back where they were, it will be easy. Sometimes it's a simple point of, can we talk? And that satisfies them. And I come from a particular culture where if you ever entered into an African village, the simplest thing you do is pick up a bottle of schnapps, take it to the local chief to announce your arrival, and once they take it off your hand, that's it. Everything in the village is yours. Feel free to do whatever you like. I mean, this is the culture. Now, if you imagine somebody who, because they have a concession license from the central government in some faraway town, then bulldozes their way into this village without doing the very simple thing that would have connected them with the community. Think how stupid is that? So in a sense, I prefer prevention if I can. But when you have caused the harm, just stand back and think of what is the easiest way or what's the best way to solve this. Frankly, between you and I, litigation should be the last stop. You could solve many problems without going to litigation. If only you will be sincere enough to assess for yourself where you think the solution lies. And they're not that difficult. So if you kept it simple, I think it will work. And yes, I understand that we are struggling with this idea of home-state dispute settlement processes. And I have no idea. There's been a recent case in the Court of Appeal, I think, which is the biggest disaster as far as I can imagine. I think the court, or I don't know how the barristers persuaded the court, but some of these should have been put before the court. But that's where litigation is saying, frustration, disappointment, it costs money that nobody has. Frankly, we should take 10 steps back and see if we could solve it. So for me, that's simplicity is my answer. In other words, my colleague Surya Diva talks about a bouquet of remedies. So you have flowers with different bits, a bouquet with different bits in it. So if the rose doesn't fit, get the geraniums. If that doesn't fit, get the other one. So empower yourself with this bouquet and then pick the one that fits in different circumstances. That's Surya's analogy. That's a difficult one. I wish I can have a very simple answer. I mean, it's that consciousness. A lot of these companies genuinely believe that what they're doing is not wrong. And it seems to me it's the equivalent of not making the bond. If we can get to the point where they have a similar consciousness of the impact of what they're doing, we won't have this difficulty. And for as long as we don't make that bond, I'm afraid these issues will continue to rise and we'll never have an effective remedy framework. We're going to have to compel them in all manner of trickery in different ways to make them pay attention, which is just not right. It's a waste of time. So the idea is to find the effective ways of making them understand what is required. Okay. So I haven't answered your question, but in a sense, there isn't an answer that I could think of.
Great. Michael, please.
Might I answer the word? I just have one question in the wake of Susan's question. Welcoming a catastrophe.
Yes.
With all due respect to my president, Donald Trump. And I'm asking this only in the sense that, you put up Nikki Haley and I think John Bolton, and there's a hearty critique in this administration for the United Nations. And I, there are many among us who respect the rule of law and our election process, but we also worry about some of the ways in which this is moving forward. And you would have a better insight into the United Nations than we would, but the impact of that kind of talk and that kind of seeming lack of respect for that project that is the United Nations. And this is a 30,000-foot level question, less the particulars of your work. But could you just address that briefly as to what that might mean and how you see us in our way addressing that or drawing against it?
Well, I mean, I suppose I restrict my answer to the United States. And again, it's one of the countries to which I had the pleasure of doing a country visit. And I thought I knew that country fairly well until I did a country visit. The distance between Washington, D.C. and, what's the capital of West Virginia? No.
Richmond?
Is it Richmond?
Charleston.
No, Charleston in West Virginia. It's about a half an hour flight. But the lifestyle, yeah, it's shocking. And that when we went to West Virginia, we're dealing with surface coal mining, which required having to clear mountaintops. And so people who live there have to live with all atrocious conditions. And here is the interesting thing. We thought this was a quite emblematic violation of human rights. And so we came to our friends in the State Department and thought, now this you need to pay attention to. And they took one look at us, West Virginia, and they rolled their eyes. So I understand that we can fixate our attention on the president, but I promise you there's more in the system than just the president that believes in a certain way of doing business. And the president is only a product of what the community thinks. So I think we play a lot to the local gallery. We don't play enough to the international gallery. In an election time, anybody who sings the United Nations will get nothing. Anybody who sings bringing a wall to Texas will win. So it's the nature of the country, and not everybody appreciates what the United Nations has achieved. And it has achieved a lot. We need to be able to communicate this in places that matter. And I think the United States is one of those places where we need to be able to sell the United Nations in a slightly more positive light. Not that goes for you and I. I'm not counting on the politicians. No way. Because I haven't. The only politicians who may have said something slightly constructive is Jimmy Carter, as far as I know. I dare say even Eleanor Roosevelt's husband, Franklin, didn't even have much to say about the United Nations. But of course, he gave it a chance. He gave it a chance because those were the early days. But it's the nature of politicians, and we need to bypass the politicians and share with them. I had the benefit of taking one or two of my students to the United Nations in a few weeks, and I dare say that we had a briefing from the U.S. mission, and I was very impressed with the very critical questions that the students posed, and I thought, no, that's right, that's the way they take it. I got a call back from the chief legal officer, and as well, I thought your students were asking some very difficult questions, and I thought, I'm glad. So that's the kind of the way we need to communicate with the government and the people of the United States, and therefore other countries as well.
Michael, thank you very much. I think that's an extraordinary set of questions, but also a great one to finish on. I want to just, first of all, thank very much the team that's put this together. Phenomenal piece of work. And of course, that team is not just doing this lecture, but also a whole series, which I'm sure you'll be interested in, particularly the next one, which is on the right to bear arms. I've heard that's a relatively important topic at the moment. I think the other thing I just wanted to say before we end is a huge thanks to Michael for really enlightening us in the way that you have this evening. As I was listening to you, you'll hate this, I think, because the comparison is an important one, but I was thinking of Martin Luther King, actually, and I was thinking of the fact that he said something that touched my heart a long time ago, which is he called on people to marry power and love. He said that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power can be ineffective and anemic. And only by bringing those two things together can a movement genuinely seek the kind of changes that we need in this world, the kind of transformation that we need in this world, as well as the incremental reform that we also need in this world. And I think in many ways your remarks have highlighted that, but I think also the human warmth that you've brought to your chairmanship, vice chairmanship and membership of the working group will be, as remembered for many years to come, and the effectiveness of your approach will also be remembered. So thank you very much to Michael.